So, after looking at the legal aspect and the psychological aspect and the medical aspect since yesterday, today the next topic that we are going to discuss, which we have a very interesting speaker with us today to talk about it, is the research angle. Because we all agree and realize that research in child sexual abuse is not only unavailable in an Indian context. There's very limited research, both quantitative and qualitative. But also a big problem that we face is that how do we conduct this research? So we have with us Dr. Shubhada Maitra from TISS, who's going to talk about this. And Dr. Maitra is a professor at the Center for Health and Mental Health School of Social Work, TISS, Mumbai. She has a master's in medical and psychiatric social work from TISS, Mumbai, and a PhD in social work from Mumbai University. She is involved in teaching, field action, research, and training. Her areas of interest include mental health, gender, sexuality, and violence with a focus on women and children. Her PhD thesis focused on mental health consequences of childhood sexual abuse. She also heads Muskan, the Child and Adolescent Guidance Center of TISS and Tarasha. Currently, she is engaged in action research towards sensitizing BMC school children on issues related to gender and violence, funded by ICRW. She is associated with several organizations and engages with issues pertaining to mental health, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment at the workplace. Her topic for today that she's going to talk about is From Shame and Secrecy to Disclosures, Methodology and Ethics in Childhood Sexual Abuse Research. Over to you.
Good afternoon, and thanks to the foundation team members for having me here. From 1.5 days of churning on ground level issues, I'm going to take you to the world of research, which is quite a topic that is close to my heart. To me, child sexual abuse is a children's issue. It is a sexuality issue. It means that we are really negating affirmative sexuality experiences to children, and it is an abuse issue because when we talk of abuse and violence, we're really talking about patriarchy, we're talking about power, we're talking about male supremacy and subjugation and subordination of women's experiences, women's very being. What is the context in which we need to now look at research? We still continue to hold families as sacrosanct, families as safe spaces, families as nurturing spaces, and yet all of us who are working on issues of child sexual abuse know that a whole lot of abuse happens in these very safe spaces, in the spaces that are meant to protect children. At the social level, we have a whole lot of discourse and dialogue around child sexual abuse. So we have, in that sense, a socio-political context that is just ripe to undertake research and to lobby for advocacy and, really upscale interventions. This was not so 10 years back, and therefore conducting research around child sexual abuse was, it continues to be sensitive, but also taboo 10 years back. It may not be so taboo today, is what I think. We have recent legislation on CSA, and yet the media coverage continues to be on abuse and violence in the public domain. We have very, very little reporting of abuse that happens within the families, and we know a whole lot of abuse is perpetrated by people who are known to the child and the woman. The kind of research that we need, because there is increased reporting of abuse, and I'm going to really stick to child sexual abuse and violence, and when I say child sexual abuse, I'm really looking at a range from contact to non-contact, and not just limiting to one end of the continuum where I'm focusing on sexual assault and forced intercourse. We need to understand the trends and patterns. What are the trends and patterns across different populations? urban, rural, community-based, clinical populations, populations divided by gender, disability. What kind of, okay, or we need to understand also the prevalence. What is the, we don't have too many studies. We have one Government of India study in 2005, but that's not exclusive on sexual abuse. It focuses much more on abuse. It excludes some very important settings. So we need to understand these trends and patterns across settings, community, school, clinical settings, populations, all of that. We need to understand the phenomenon with its full complexity. And what do I mean by complexity? While I said there was a greater discourse and dialogue around child sexual abuse, the language becomes complex as we move from sex to sexuality, to sexual abuse within the family setting. How are we going to capture this complexity? How are we going to collect data when it is so much complicated? Are we going to say, did you have experiences of sexual abuse? Are we going to not be judgmental in a particular way that will put off the children or women if we're doing retrospective studies? But we really need to understand the phenomenon in its complexity. We also need to understand the induction seduction strategies that the perpetrator uses. What is it that is, there may not be violence always. There may be a lot of hidden threats. There may not be coercion. A lot of children um, may be tempted, may be groomed, and we all of us know that, may be groomed into the abuse experience such that children begin to own it. Children begin to believe that they are somewhere responsible, that they enjoyed it, that they wanted it, and we need to look at all of this. We need to plan interventions across the continuum, from promotion, prevention, to healing, recovery, to justice, and study what works at the ground level. I know there are different interventions in different pockets of India, and a whole lot of them are undocumented. We need to really understand what works. We need to understand what are the positives. So while child sexual abuse, I was just saying this to Janvi when we were discussing the topic, and I said, there's so much morbidity, there's so much negativity. We don't need to focus only on that. We need to focus on the positives. We need to focus on women's aspirations, women's current positive experiences, and what has helped them survive. And finally, influence policy, policy at school level. What are the kind of policies that we really need? We have prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace. What are the policies that we have at the school level? Do we have grievance redressal cells? Do we have prevention of sexual harassment at the school level? Do we have a school health, school mental health policy? Do we have policies to have counselors in schools? So there is a whole lot of things that we need to use research as a platform to advocate, to move, to, just continue to do the kind of work that we are doing. If we need to understand child sexual abuse, we need to understand it, I believe, in the paradigm of disclosure. We all know disclosures are delayed, don't happen soon after the incidents take place. We know why disclosures are delayed. When disclosures do happen soon after, and I'm going to give you an example, a 9-year-old girl went to her grandmother soon after she was, held tightly and kissed on her cheek by her uncle's friend. And she's sitting on her grandmother's lap, and she said, Nani, this one kissed me. And the nanny is saying to the girl, oh, but you are such a lovely girl. Anyone would want to kiss you. And the girl says, 9-year-old, but I didn't like the way he kissed me. And the nanny says, oh, you must be mad. And after that, she shut up. She shut up till she spoke to me as an adult woman and talked about her. That was the first. But if we just listen to children. And, so either we have to get people to disclose their experiences, or we have to discover. Discover we don't. We want to be blind, we want to be deaf. As adults, when child sexual abuse happens, I think as a society, as adults, we are failing our children. And children give enough signs, I believe. Amit did a presentation yesterday. I'm sorry I missed it, but children give enough, and all of you who are working in at the field level, you know, enough signs, but we don't catch these signs, and therefore we need to understand how, if we have to understand, we have to facilitate disclosures. My own research focused on mental health in terms of not just morbidity and distress, but also on selfhood, relationship, sexuality issues. Now I'm going to move to my research and do a discussion on research within the context of what I did. Quickly, the objectives of my research were the dynamics and context of child sexual abuse. I wanted to explore ways, not so much what happened to the women, what was the kind of abuse, but what happened in their heads when they were children. And this was a retrospective study on adult women. And now, how do they process their experience? How did they process their experience as children? How do they process it now? So I kept doing the then and now. Understand the mental health consequences of child sexual abuse. And I also did a quantitative part where I looked at women's subjective well-being vis-a-vis child sexual abuse. What are the ethical issues? Normally, one would expect an ethical issue slide at the end of the this thing. And I feel when we start research, we have to begin thinking about ethics. So one of the first issues was, how do I locate myself in the research process? So this has, and you know, all of you who want to do research or who are engaged in research, why is it that we pick a particular topic to research? Where is it coming from? What are our own experiences? Personal, from the field, from theoretical understanding, our worldviews around particular issues. Where are we? I think it's very important to start with the self when we begin thinking and conceptualize research. And I started like that. When I went to college students, I talked about the aam pe, you know, the experiences of harassment that happened, and that have happened across my own childhood. Uh, and you know, then I say, well, it happens with all most girls, and this is what I want to explore. At all points, although I was a researcher, I was very clear in how that was another location issue. I was very clear in my identity. I was a social worker first and then a researcher. So my research objectives were only secondary to upholding women's safety. And therefore, the kind of tools that I designed, I had to be very, very clear, very sure that these were very quick, non-intrusive, didn't go too much into memory, didn't go too much into a very troubling, traumatic, distressing experience that participants would have while answering a particular questionnaire. But you know, you move quickly. So the kind of tools that you design need to be non-intrusive. If you're doing a quantitative, even if you're doing a qualitative, non-intrusive to the extent that you allow the woman to say, well, I'm not going to do this, and you're okay with moving ahead with research. Safety net, for my own research, I did 30 in-depth interviews with women, 5 of whom were survivors of a self-identified self-help group. I'm going to say this quickly because this is very difficult for me to say. I put out the tape recorder. She continued to look at me. I didn't give her eye contact. I began looking at the floor because I knew how difficult it was for her to even articulate her experience. She talked 5 minutes, 7 minutes, completed her narration. I was silent for a bit. and I didn't ask her a single question on that. She didn't tell me not to ask, but the moment she said, I'm going to say it quickly and I'm going to, just put off the tape recorder, I knew it was difficult for her to say it. So your tool is one, and you yourself are a tool. So how do you use both in combination is something that we need to think about. Negotiating consent is an ongoing process, not once that you take a tappa and you move on. But consent to save your backside or consent to uphold your participants' rights is something. So what are the principles through which you do consent? And then how do you uphold the principles while you are, conducting your research? How much time do I have? Sorry, I didn't time myself when I started. And then finally, memory and recall. Any retrospective work on this kind of an issue will come in question around issues of memory and recall. So how do you do it? You do it closer to the experience. So I had chosen women, all adult women, 18 to 25, but the women who belong to the survivors group, my oldest woman was 49 years old. And I extended that category because I said these were women who were articulating not only to themselves, but to a group who had come out, who had a political understanding of child sexual abuse, and therefore it was okay for me to extend that. How much time?
We'll tell you when you have 5 more minutes.
That will be too chaotic. Okay, pilots, I work from a feminist perspective. So
10 more minutes.
okay, thank you. I work from a feminist perspective, and I believe that child sexual abuse is out there in the community. It's not there in clinical populations. Anytime prevalence from very conservative to up to 80%. And this has come through workshops, several workshops that we have attended, facilitated all of. Now, if it is so prevalent, it should be easy to catch it. I wanted not to do a clinical study. I wanted to do a community-based study. I wanted to do a participatory study. Just around that time, I was invited by an organization to conduct some participatory workshops. I said, let's do it. On body and sexuality, we did a 10-session workshop on body and sexuality, imagining that issues of child sexual abuse would come. They did come a little bit, but these were married women between, say, 30 and 45, community-based, belonged to a self-help group. I started with women wanted to participate. I talked about child sexual abuse at the end of difficult experiences. Women wanted to participate in the interviews. Out of the 30 women, 25 women signed up for in-depth interviews. I began the interviews, and it took me almost 3 sessions to come to CSA. Because what women started with were their own experiences, marriage, domestic violence, growing children, children's issues, all of that. So that was really not working, and I realized that I was looking for a needle in a haystack. Then I went to offices because I wanted to do across socioeconomic groups. I went to offices, and again the same experience. And the lessons learned from this was the ethics. I stopped quickly. I think I did about 3 interviews in the community, and I said, well, this is not working. But the ethics of scratching old wounds. A woman who's 40 doesn't want to, she wants to discuss her marriage and domestic violence. Doesn't want to go back to 25 years के पहले क्या हुआ था मेरे साथ. Also, when we want to research CSA, we need a starting point for discussion. And these kind of interviews were really not giving me a starting point for discussion. So I changed my methodology. This was a primarily qualitative, but there was a preliminary quantitative study. I ran the subjective well-being inventory. For those of you who are aware, is a 40-item questionnaire on assessing the current status of mental health of populations, followed by a quick 14-item screening instrument for child sexual abuse, which I had developed myself. And based on the screening instrument, I selected the participants. So these were college students, 18 years and above, across socioeconomic groups in Bombay and another city belonging to a survivors group. So the phase one was subjective well-being inventory. I did it with 214 women. I had to discard some because these were incomplete. And phase two was in-depth interviews over multiple sessions. I'm going to quickly run through the findings. Uh, the reported presence and type of the 209, 77% women reported any kind of sexual abuse from contact to non-contact. Almost an equal percentage of women reported both contact and non-contact abuse, and more than half the women had experienced both contact and non-contact abuse. Most times, perpetrators were strangers in 65% of cases, but hold your breath or don't hold your breath. We know all this. The known persons were in 55% of the cases, perpetrators were known to the women. 17% were of the women were abused by very close family members. Nearly 50% were abused by those in the social network. And about 9% of the women were abused by both family and non-family members. Uh, both is 20%. What is that, both 20%? Strangers and known person. How smart is that? Sorry. On the qualitative, out of 30 women that I had in-depth interviews, 17 had experienced abuse by close family members. So this is more than 50%. Whereas our earlier slide says intrafamilial is 17%. Is this a problem of underreporting? Well, I don't know. But in a contact, when you're doing in-depth interviews, multiple sessions, you build rapport, you build trust. Then 17 women said shared experience of abuse by family members. They were also abused by non-family members. So one of the things that I realized, if there was non-contact abuse, if there was contact abuse, there was also non-contact abuse. So any woman, any child reporting non-contact abuse, one must go to the extent of exploring contact abuse as well. Anyone talking about abused by strangers, one must move to the immediate family and known circles. For 19 women, abuse was recurrent and extensive, lasting between 6 months to 11 years. One of the participants was abused in a single incident she was raped actually, by indigenous healer. Quickly, qualitative findings. Do you want me to read? You will read. So there was a lot of, on selfhood, women talked about lowered self-esteem, missing attributions. Even when they were good at something, they didn't believe they were good at something. Believing that they're socially inadept. People don't seek me out. Another one, self-esteem suffered a great deal because of abuse. Am I worth it? The worth aspect has come up a lot. Need hard evidence. I'm my worst enemy. I berate myself. I really put myself down. Sexuality, again, multiple sexual experiences, very, very difficult sexual experiences. One of the women said, if a good boy showed interest in me, I would run. I would run for my life. It was only the bad men that I went after. And this was essentially to confirm to herself that the world is not a safe place. I'm wanted only for sexual, I don't have any other qualifications, in a manner of speaking. And, I'm really not worth it. So tied up a whole lot to self and other issues. No notion of boundaries. In the morning, someone talked about, well, I forget, but that time I said, well, it's not uh, for anything that women get into multiple sexual relationships. Largely, it is about the issues about boundaries. You don't respect your own, you don't hold up your own, and you violate others because their boundaries have been transgressed when they were growing up. And that is what I meant when I started out by saying negation of affirmative sexuality. You know, this is a girl who says, I just had a lot of sex. Yes, I did fall in love a couple of times, but never had a steady relationship. Different men all the time. It didn't ever occur to her when she didn't like it to say, stop, I don't want it. I was 19, my notion of sexuality, selfhood was so, there was this person who was completely 195% in love. So here is a woman who talks about boundaries and how she pushed his boundaries. And finally he dumped her. She says, dumped her. He couldn't survive. And she says, well, then my sense of abandonment was complete. I knew that the world would abandon me, that I'm alone. And, you know, this is a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that women. Well, this was a very, very vivid, you know, young girl. I think this was a 23-year-old girl, seduced by a trusted family friend. And she used to see images, not nightmares, of men being hanged upside down, men and women. She would have fantasies of killing others, and when she was young, but she didn't ever connect it to her abuse experience. Extensive abuse led to difficult mother daughter relationships because women believed that their mothers could have protected them better. Difficulty in establishing peer relationships in childhood, the whole notion of being different. Those of you who are familiar with Finkelhorst's work will know where I'm coming from when I'm talking about differentness, or even Wieland's work on internalizations. Reduced social contact and inability to trust men. Feeling sad, lonely. I haven't given figures here because this is from my qualitative data. One more minute. Feeling sad, 5 minutes, okay. Feeling sad, lonely, tearful, confused. There were eating difficulties. I don't call it psychiatric symptoms simply because these were self-reported, and we need to look at these as experiences of distress rather than clinically diagnosed categories. And when there have been clinically diagnosed, so for example, a couple of women were diagnosed for clinical depression, another one was diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. Self-harm, attempted suicide. There was one girl who talked about, you know, going only after the bad boys. Ever since she was 19, she has gotten into every kind of problem with law for drug peddling. She used to do drugs. She was part of a gang. Very colorful life she led. And, you know, she went to a psychiatrist for her substance abuse issue. And she talked about her. Now, how many of us really talk about a sexual abuse experience in a, and he had not questioned her about, but she said, well, I think, you know, there was some difficult experience and all of that. No question on that. He began and ended with the substance abuse. Of course, the substance abuse was never cured, quote unquote, but sexual abuse continued to create trauma in her adult life. There were sleep disorders, flashbacks, nightmares, alcohol and substance abuse, panic phobia. These were. So dissociation, MPD, multiple personality disorders, or dissociative identity disorder, amnesia. Um, in conclusion, this is my last slide. This is a sensitive area of engagement. And like I said, begins with the self. We need to move beyond the morbid to assess the current strengths and aspirations of women. We can't ever forget. So to tell a woman to say, forget these experiences, is human mind is not like that. You know, we don't, and particularly we'll forget the positive. But the negative, we have one big fat brown or black book and we store everything in that. And we don't forget that. So it's important, from my experience, it's important to say, yes, it happened, to acknowledge that it was not my responsibility, that my body may have responded, but, you know, definitely I didn't want it like this. And to move on, it's a part of you. but you need to, you are, you know, more than this experience is something that we need to do. And finally, the personal is political. Until we don't make it, so if we, like I said in my first this thing, that abuse is a patriarchy, is a power issue, is an issue of masculinity, is an issue of negation of affirmative sexuality. Where are we in all of this? Are we doing it because it's hot? Or are we doing it because we believe that women's lives are full of these kind of experiences? And we need to have interventions. We need to know what works. We need to move people. And recovery is not a short term. So this 39-year-old, I'm going to end with her quote. She told me, when we were ending the interview, she said, Shubhada, I have done it all. I have done the drugs. I have done alcohol. I have, snorted. And she's talked about these experiences. She says, in therapy, she went through an experience where she said, I came out of that session and I began to realize that alcohol is just a foul tasting, sharp smelling spirit. And I knew what it was. And damn it, I don't even drink, I don't do drugs, I don't have sex. And yet she had a lot of suicidal thoughts, and so she had a safety plan. She never kept any matchboxes, never kept sharp instruments in her house. Well, I shall stop there. Thank you. Yeah, Pooja.
I'm just wondering, with all this in the entire research, did you find anybody talking about a woman abusing them?
Yes.
And how many was that out of how many
One.
cases? One.
One out of the 30 death interviews. In the 209, I didn't ask the sex of the perpetrator.
Okay, thanks.
Ethics first. Ethics first. Uh, you know, just to tell you, I developed my methodology, all of this that I talked about, over 6 months. And this was not very long ago, about 10, 12 years ago. And I was agonizing. I said, so late in my life, so late in my career, why am I taking so long to develop the methodology? So I had initially considered whether I should do work with children and look at interventions with children. So the issue was not only of consent, but the issue of what are the kind of, like with adult women, I could refer to what are the interventions in place for children if it comes up through, and I wouldn't have done a verbal, I would have done through play and through stories and creative expressive media. And if it did come up, what am I to do as a researcher, as a social worker? Do I bring it to the notice of parents? We didn't even have a law there. What is it? So from prevention, from healing, recovery to justice, I was myself unclear. Now, what were the safety nets for this child? Who would do healing recovery work with these children? Are we equipped to do that? And in the absence of, I was not convinced myself. So I said, I can't do children.
I asked this because very often in a year, we'll get about at least 15 requests from students who I expect their guides to know better and guide them better. But these students all come to us saying, oh, we want to do research with children. And what do you want to do research with children about? The most obvious, prevalence. I said, prevalence is done, over,
No,
finished.
we don't need
So
prevalence.
what are you looking at? And how do you do the research with kids? And how do you access the kids? And I think this whole ethical aspects of research has to be incorporated into your research methodologies in your college. Yeah.
So your participant safety, how do you assess, above everything else, above your research objectives? So, I did a quantitative, qualitative. I could have done a quantitative and done very good numbers on all the mental health morbidity. I didn't. I could have gone back to my original 209. And of the 209, I had given an option of anonymously filling out the questionnaires. 160 or 180 gave their names and contact numbers. So there is a need to talk, but I mean, we need to know how to go about it. So definitely, children, till we have good, strong interventions that we are confident about, I won't even go there. No more questions? Did I put you off? Research is not overwhelming. It is fun. It's sensitive, but it's extremely empowering. So approach your research on child sexual abuse to say this is perhaps the first time women are going to disclose abuse, and that first time is going to open up more doors and windows. So that's something that, just the possibilities of talking is itself. Yes, Amit.
Thank you so much for sharing very, very insightful stories. Uh, you know, continuing from what you were saying, Vidya, I think um, getting into research in the community, like you uh, do in other mental disorders or any other field, prevalence and what have you, or treatment outcomes, is like a minefield. Because the moment you get into it, I think you're actually digging up, unraveling a Pandora's box, and you don't know what you're going to encounter, including all the things that you were talking about, the patriarchy, the rigid systems, the power issues in the community. So you're actually addressing all that at once. So to be able to uh, get any kind of research data, I think the best bet is to actually first begin to look at treatment and therapy first, and then documenting that very systematically,
Right.
whether it is in the clinic, whether it is with barefoot counselors who go out into the community, and then look at treatment outcome as well. So it's a long-term process. It's a long haul, really.
So,
But
the
of
kind of,
course, we
that's
need
the
it, no
kind of,
doubt. Yeah.
yeah, that's the kind of research we really need to document interventions across a range. So, healing and treatment intervention, what are the kind of interventions? Who's doing it? What is working? What is not? What does it tell us? Prevention, promotion, interventions, justice, all of that is something that needs to be documented. And there was
Just
a
one
hand
question.
there, yeah.
I'm Ramesh from Hyderabad. We are a group called Break the Silence. We are a citizens initiative. I was just wondering if there's any data on the mind of the perpetrator. Where does he operate from? It's very intriguing to understand that. And another thing, have you ever thought of doing a similar research on male survivors and the morbidity that goes with that? I think it would be
Well,
very
in the
interesting
beginning,
to,
yeah, so
because data says that there are, so many male children who are abused, which means so many male survivors.
sure,
So
sure. I
what goes
recognize
behind it?
that.
Yeah.
I recognize that, and at the beginning of my, so who am I going to select? How am I going to select? I very consciously chose women because all my work experiences is with women, some with children and adolescents. But I consciously didn't choose adult men because I didn't, one, want to diffuse my findings. Two is, how was I going to explain if findings around sexuality came up? I didn't know how I would explain it and, things like that. So I wanted to stay within, women's experiences because there were no studies. And I said, well, let me start with women and then we can think of going to men. What was your other question? Our mindset of perpetrators. This again, nothing that I do is apolitical. So I think that it may be interesting for someone else to take on this kind of a research. And yet I want to concentrate my energies with women. So, someone else who wants to work in a corrective kind of a paradigm, who wants to develop programs with perpetrators and do some kind of long-term work with them to see how one can change the perpetrators. And yet I feel, and therefore I decided not to, no, there is currently in India no research on perpetrators. Also, 77% of abuse across the continuum either we are living in a sick society, which I believe we are not, because these are men who are carrying on their lives very beautifully, okay? Or it is a parent patriarchy. So there, I didn't want to go there, but of course anyone else is welcome to.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond to your question. There isn't much research on abusers, but we did find there's this research that qualitative research that Dr. Rajat Mitra he's a Delhi-based psychiatrist who's done with some abusers, and he went and interviewed some of the sex abusers, largely child sexual abusers, in Tihar jail, and he's put together a research. We tried to get him for the seminar, but somehow it did not work out. So maybe next time, if he's available, we could get him in.
Can I say something?
Sorry. Yeah, just last.
Very quick,
quickly.
yeah. Shubhada, Dr. Maya Kriplani from Jaslok. I'm so happy you spoke about the need to move from the morbid experiences to strengths and aspirations. Because I feel each one of us here, it may not be a CSA experience, but each one of us here has had a negative experience. And I think to help the women or children empower within themselves to see and go beyond one situation or even the whole breathtaking experience, the so much negativity and suffering that they are experiencing, to move beyond that and see somewhere the beauty of, you know, a sunrise in the morning. I think that would be so nice. And I'm so happy that you brought that about.
Last section of the tool was on that. What are your current aspirations? What are some of the lost opportunities because of this experience? And how do you see your future now? So I did a that was also the toning down of all that we discussed and bringing it all together in a positive, ending the interview on a positive, again to do with participants.
Thank you.